Try that and set it in a big place there. Oh, okay, we've got some people coming in. Give it a couple more minutes so that we can get some more people coming in. And we'll get started. Seeing some familiar names trickling in. All right, I'm going to get started so we don't, so we're not sitting here in awkward silence. But before I do that, let me start recording. Oh, it looks like somebody already is recording. Awesome. Okay. Hello, welcome to our 5th webinar in this series. This one is going to be on the REST API. It kind of expands the scope of these webinars a little bit, and I'll explain that. Thus far, we've been doing toolkit webinars. Toolkit is actually like one corner of what we call the Shotgun ecosystem. It's all the different ways in which you can interact with Shotgun. So all of our different APIs, all the different like hooks and ways in that we have to accessing, using, modifying our data. So with that, yeah. So this is the first one that kind of introduces you guys to the greater API. I'm sorry, to the greater ecosystem rather. So before we do start, I wanted to make a pitch about SIGGRAPH. We will be there in grand form. We hope to see as many of you guys as we can. We have a lot planned. Most relevant to this group, we'll be having a full developer day. Turn off my lamp. A full developer day of courses on the Monday of SIGGRAPH about all of these like different ways that you can interact and develop for Shotgun. And then there's like greater Autodesk stuff. There's a vision series with a lot of our clients who are doing cool stuff on, I believe, the Tuesday and Wednesday. So here is, I will share with you guys the link for the Dev Day registration, as well as the Autodesk page. So we hope to see you with that stuff. And finally, I will just mention you guys can put in questions throughout this process, and we'll try and get to them at the end. And with that, I'll hand it over to Brandon Ashworth, who's one of our senior engineers, who's been doing, oh, to answer that question right there, no, you don't need a SIGGRAPH pass for a dev. I don't believe you need a SIGGRAPH pass at all for a dev day. I think that you can just register and show up. You certainly don't need like a fancy pass. Yeah, so with that, I'll turn it over. Brandon Ashworth is one of our senior engineers who's been working on the REST API for a while now. He's going to talk you through it. People have been very excited about it, so hopefully you guys will be too. And that's it. Over to you, Brandon.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. And yeah, so let's start playing this thing. So my name's Brandon. As Tana said, I'm on the ecosystem team as a software engineer. I've been working on REST API for quite a while now, it feels like. But yeah, so we're just going to go over some different parts of the REST API, talk about what we've done, how we've designed it, and then go over some usage and some examples. So let's click on the right thing. So yeah, so talk about it. So I'll go over the documentation, show you where it is, how it all works, what you can get out of it, what specs we're following for the REST API, so you can understand some of our design decisions that we've made. How to use the REST API, some basic usage information, some things that are standard for all REST APIs, but also some things that are specific to ours. And then we'll have some time, we'll go over some examples. And after that, hopefully we'll have enough time to answer some questions. So let's talk about the Shotgun REST API. So it came out in 7.9. We added support for basic entity and CRUD requests and our authorization and authentication for the API. And then in 7.10, we kind of put the pedal to the metal, and we added all the stuff you need for entities. So you now have full CRUD support, revive, summarize batch, file uploading, downloading, following and unfollowing entities, the activity stream for entities, and the text search, also known as the autocomplete. We also added in full support for Schema CRUD. So you now can read all your entity types. You can also create, read, update, and delete all of your fields that you have permissions to deal with for that. So you can now manipulate all that through the API. And we added a new feature called preferences. This allows you access to the preferences for your site. This has also just been added to the Python API also. So right now, our current state is we're about probably 80% complete with coverage of the Python API. 7.11 will actually finish all that off, and we'll be adding more stuff in the future, hopefully. So the documentation for this. So the documentation lives over on our developer site, developer.shotgunsoftware.com/rest-api. We can jump over to the documentation, take a look. So here we have all of the information you need for dealing with the REST API. We've got some information about how to set up a dev environment using Postman, which is kind of most of our tool of choice for interacting with the REST API quickly. We have a collection you can download if you want to download this and play around with it. It's a little bit older right now. It only has the entity stuff in it. We're working on updating it. We're working on also making it easier to use because of how tokens work. It's a little bit more complicated right now, but we have a solution for making that seamless and a lot quicker. You'll actually see me use that solution in my demos. Authenticate, we have like in-depth information about authentication, making requests, and handling responses. We'll actually go over a lot of that in this webinar. Then we have all of our endpoints documented and some other sections for like, here's all the different objects that we're using inside the API. So if we take a look at this, we jump down to probably the simplest endpoint. That's the info endpoint. This is just at our root. You can see it gives you a 200 if it worked, which it always should work. And then you can see some of the data it returns. And over on the right-hand side, you'll see there's some tabs with different languages and different specs and tools. And these are just examples auto-generated by the documentation system for you to play around with this. So if we were to copy this, and I've already copied it and updated my host name, I'm going to pipe it into JQ, and you can see what the response looks like from my Shotgun instance. So we get back the data object, and we get back some values. And that's cool, but it's curl. Like, it's really simple. But let's go into something slightly more advanced. We can copy over the Python one, and the Python one works just fine. We just need to go up and update our host name. I've already installed requests and everything to make this easy. It does use requests by default. And then we can run the same thing, and we'll get back the same value. So yesterday night, I decided to make it a little bit more fun. And so I took the Go one and spent about 5 minutes playing around with it, adding in the structure for the data so that I can unmarshal that. And I wrote a really simple command line tool now that you can now run. You could run anytime you wanted and be like, okay, just tell me what the Shotgun version is. It took me all of probably 5 minutes. You compile it, and now you have a single binary you can ship anywhere. So that's a Linux or in this case, an OS X system, and get that value back. So that's the documentation. It's got a lot of information. It's got a lot of examples. We're working on improving some of the examples because there are some things that are a little bit hard to understand. The concepts, mainly uploading files, is a little bit complicated because it's a little bit more advanced than what it was in the Python API. We hid a lot of stuff from you in the Python API. And yeah, and we're also thinking about seeing if we can get other languages in here too, because I know there's been some requests. So go back to PowerPoint. So let's talk about the specs we follow. So I wanted to talk about the specs just because I wanted you to understand some of the design decisions we made. They may seem kind of non-standard, but they actually do follow specs that are already out there in the wild. So the first one we follow is the JSON API spec. We follow 1.0 of that. That is actually the latest version. This spec defines all of the routes and responses that come back from our API or were used to get data and to respond with. The one great thing about this is since it is a spec and it has a pretty good following, there are a lot of client libraries already. So you don't have to deal with all the HTTP stuff and deal with figuring out how to traverse through the data. It will handle all that. You just have to you will probably want to wrap it to make a cleaner API for your users. I will say for Python, there is no Python 2 version of the client library currently that I've found. It's all Python 3. Sorry. The other spec we follow is the Open API spec. Well, it used to be called Swagger. It's now, as of V3, it became Open API. So this is a spec for defining the documentation structure, or how to document your APIs. So you generate a spec file. It's got all of your authentication information. It's got all of your routes and your parameters and your request bodies and your responses. And this is great because it's really everything you need to know about the API. And that documentation you just saw was 100% generated from our spec file. We put everything into the spec file and we just run a tool to generate out that documentation site. That also means you can generate client libraries. So there's some tools out there. Starting to be more tools out there. V3 of the API is a little bit newer. It's about a little less than a year, but it's been being slowly adopted. But they're tools to generate client libraries. We know there are some issues currently with some of the compiled languages, so we're trying to work out some of that. And there's also some naming issues for things that are like inline that we need to pull out and make a little bit cleaner, so you can understand you can have a full client library that you could just use full time. So let's go in and start talking about usage. So we actually do follow. So let's start with Auth. We actually do follow a third spec, but it's so common that I didn't put it on that page. We follow OAuth 2. We've added support for a few of the grant types in OAuth 2. The grant types are basically just different ways to send credentials in and get an access token back. We support three of the standard ones, and we have a custom grant type. Luckily, OAuth 2 allows for that. One of the differences between the REST API's authentication and the Python APIs is the Python API, we send the credentials every request. In the REST API, you're only going to have to send your credentials really as many times as you want to. You can send them. You send them once, you get back your access token, refresh token. You can continue using that until you decide that the user needs to, or your tokens have expired. So let's go through the grant types. First is the client credentials. This is really just your API script name and API key. They're just called client ID and client secret. The next one is password. Password is your human user username and password. And then we have our one of the special ones, that's the refresh token. This is, you take your refresh token that you received by using client credentials or password or the fourth one, and you then can regenerate a new access token and refresh token. And we'll go over the refresh tokens a little bit more on the next slide. And then the last one's a custom grant type, and that is the session token. And these are the session tokens you get from the Python API endpoint, its session token, or the user, or from the browser. I will note that we do not have a way to generate session tokens from the REST API, and this is because really these other options are the same thing as kind of the way you would generate a session token. So it's really, you would just be adding an extra step when you don't need it. So continuing on Auth, so I mentioned access tokens. So bearer tokens are also known as access tokens in this case. This is the value you're going to be sending as your authorization header to every request that's under a protected endpoint. So you'd pass in authorization, which is the header name, and then bearer, which is the type. And when we do look at the example of how to get an access token, I'll show you that you don't actually have to hard code this value anywhere. It actually comes back in the response. And then you have your access token. These do only last 10 minutes. And this is for security reasons. We don't want these tokens lasting for long periods of time. And then since they're transmitted on every request, we don't want it intercepted in some crazy way. But we want it to expire quickly to reduce risk. So because of that, we know that's really inconvenient. So we have refresh tokens. So refresh tokens are one-time use tokens. They last for 24 hours, and they're used to generate new access tokens and a new refresh token. It's done through the exact same endpoints, just like you would do for the other grant types. You just pass the refresh token as the value. Note, these should be treated like user credentials and stored securely. They're long lasting. They will generate new access tokens and new refresh tokens. So let's talk about some of the conventions we follow outside of the specs. So the first one we should talk about is the URI setup. So like I said before, JSON API defines our resources. So we have a little prefix on that. So like almost every API nowadays, we prefix it with API and the version. The version is there so we can version this. We can do backwards incompatible changes if we need to at some point. And then we have our API family. So this is just our logical way to group different resources together. So we have a few families currently. We have entity, schema, auth, and preferences. We'll have more in the future, I'm sure. So here's some examples. Like we have something in the entity family. It's called the resources projects. This would be where you get all projects. If it's a Git or post would create a new project. We have our schema, and this is we're looking at the project fields status list, and then we have our auth, and this is our way of getting an auth token. So you may have noticed something in that those examples for the entity names. So they're not like what you're used to in the Python API. Our convention for this is in the REST API is plural, lowercase, and snake case. So project becomes projects, custom non-project entity 2 becomes custom _ non _ project _ entity of 2s. And then I just put in this example of a connection entity. So you can see that like even though it's non-standard, it doesn't look like the normal entities, it would still resolve out to the normal way. And like all rules and conventions, there's an exception to this. You might have noticed it above. So schema family is singular. When we were developing schema, we realized it doesn't make sense to have it plural since you're only working on the entity type itself and not all of the entities or all the records. So those are the basic conventions that you'll see throughout my examples and the documentation. So let's start talking about the requests. I'm going to go over how we use the HTTP methods really quickly because they're fairly standard, but there are some non-standard things that we are doing or some things that are always debated when developing REST APIs. So the first thing is GET. That's for retrieving records. Like most REST APIs, you can only retrieve. You can never modify data using a GET request. Post, like most things, we create new records with it. We also revive records. If you use a post on a record endpoint, so like projects 5, you will, and pass the revive flag, you will revive that record if it was deleted. And then any non-standard requests or posts in most cases for us. So these are things like the search. The search is a non-standard request. It doesn't fit into a GET because it's got a complicated data structure that you need to pass in as a JSON body. So it is a post. There's a few other ones like that just, their data structures are too complicated for query strings, so they became posts. Put, this is the one that people argue all the time, whether or not it should be put or patch for updating. We use put for updating. That is the Autodesk way. And then we use put for uploading files, which is fairly standard. Lastly, delete. You can probably guess what this is used for. It's for deleting records. So next would be the headers. So headers that you need to ship with all requests. JSON API actually specifies this first one, that you need to pass the accept header. And you need to say application JSON so you can get JSON back. Just the standard part of JSON API. And the other one we already talked about, the authorization header. You need to be passing that. If you're hitting an endpoint that requires authorization, you should be passing the authorization header. You can send it to things like info, the root info. It just will get ignored. So starting to talk into like how you're retrieving records, let's talk about some of the standard query string parameters that you'll see on those types of endpoints. So the first one is filter. Filter is the filters you will use to make your query. We'll go into like how those actually work on the next couple of slides. Fields is just a comma separated list of field names to return. We did actually add star for the REST API so that you don't have to query the schema to then say, I want all the fields. So you can do that. And then 7.11, I think it is, that we're releasing that you can pass star and bubble fields so that if you want all the fields and then some connection fields, you can do that. You can get those values. Next is page. Page is an object where you can, for dealing with pagination, it's got a key of size, which is the number of records per page, and then a key of number, which is the current page number. Sort, similar to fields. It's a comma separated list of field names. You can use dash to say descending. Ascending is just the default. And then the last is options. Options is a special object where you can pass in some advanced feature flags or not feature flags, but advanced flags to the request. The most important one really is return only. So you can pass in return only and say retired to get all the retired records instead of the active records. Active is the default value for that. So let's start talking about actually how to use those filters. So in the query string, we only support 2 comparisons. And then if you've looked at our documentation before, we normally support a lot of different comparisons for data types, but in the query string, it just doesn't, there's no clean way to do it and make it look easy to read. So we decided to keep it limited to just 2 comparison types. So the first one is. So you can do an is comparison. It's just, you say filter, square bracket, the field name. This can be just the field name on the record, or you can use a bubble field if you know like you want project.project.id. is equal to a value, and we'll use that in an example in a little bit. And then it's just the value. And you can repeat these as many times as you want, but if you have the same key, the last one will, if you have the same field name anywhere, the last one will be what's picked up. So the other one is the in comparison. It's almost identical to the is, except for it's a comma separate list of values. And so we know that this isn't really, this is helpful, but there's definitely other stuff you want to do always, right? Like there's always going to be something, more complicated queries. So for this, we have a special endpoint for that. It's called the search endpoint. So the search endpoint has two different endpoints, or two different formats for dealing with it. And basically you switch between formats by changing the content type header. And so the first thing is, basically you're going to make a post request to this new endpoint, underscore search, after the entity you're looking for. You're going to set your content type. In this case, we're using vendor shotgun API3 array, JSON. And then it looks like this. It looks just like the Python a list of lists that you use normally. And this will get you a little bit further. But if you need to go even more advanced than that, we also support a hash style, which the big change is in the content in the header is the content type is changed to hash instead of array. And then you have this nice object for dealing with it, which allows you to pass a logical operator or, and then conditions. And you can pass these simple conditions like you had over in your filters over here, or you can even pass this object again to make more complicated queries. Just be careful. I mean, you can, as always, you can make queries that are so complicated that are probably bad for your server. So now that we actually kind of understand how to like retrieve data, let's talk about responses that come back. So the first thing to note, I talked about this before, JSON API actually defines all of our responses. So all these objects are just what the JSON API spec says to do. So top level, there's a few keys. We use 3 of the keys that are, 2 of them are required, one's optional. There's a few more optional ones that you can see in the documentation for JSON API. I think we actually document them also in our documentation. So the first one's data. This is going to be your array or object that contains the records for your request. If your request is to retrieve one object, like it's an endpoint for like project 5, you will get back an object. If it's like the projects endpoint and you're listing all the projects, it will be an array, even if you return one object, or return one record. And we'll look at the record object next after this slide. The next section is errors. The errors is an array of error objects. You can see the actual record or the actual error object on the JSON API documentation. It's nice. It's got a bunch of information to it. It's got like ID and error codes and human readable values and places that tell you where this key was wrong. And it's like the key is the actual name of the key that was in your data structure, and the value is what the error was for it. It's pretty nice. But one thing to note, you will never see errors and data in the same return object. It's just one of the parts of the spec, which is kind of nice. And then links. Links is the last one. It's an object that contains URLs to other resources or the current resource. You'll see this a lot with paginated requests. You'll see there will be a link section with a next and previous with the pagination updated for you. Uploads, we have an upload URL in there, so where to put the file, and then a complete URL, so you know where to send the data to complete the request. And then on normal requests, a lot of times you'll just see the link to the current page, the current resource you were accessing with all the query parameters. And then let's talk about the record object for a second. So it starts out looking like the Python one. It's got an ID, it's got a type, and then it kind of deviates. So first thing is you have attributes. So this is all of your fields on your record that are not connections. So your numbers and text and things like that. Then you have relationships, which are your multi-entity and entity connections. And so they split it up like this. At first it's a little weird, but after a while it kind of makes sense. It's like, oh, okay, well, I know where all of any data that's connected to other things, it's in here, and it's got some extra endpoints, and we'll talk about those extra endpoints in a few minutes too. And then you also have links in here. When you're looking at a record object, you'll usually have a self link so that you can go directly to the record if you need to, and get in our record endpoint actually returns all fields by default. since it is a one record only ever. So the only time could be a performance issue is if you have some massive record with hundreds upon hundreds of columns. So that's the basics. And I want to now try to go over some examples, and I actually went a lot faster than I thought I would, so we've got some more time, which is kind of nice. So we're going to go over some examples. We're going to go over like how to get an access token. We're probably going to skip the info because we looked at the info 3 times in the when we were looking at the docs. I'll show you some, like start with like a hello world type one where we'll look at all the try to get all the shots, and then we'll start filtering it down more and more and more. And then we'll also then take that same query string filters and turn it into a search. I'll show you how relationships work. We'll look at how getting files back work. We'll look at how uploading works. And then if we should have some time, and we'll look at like some of the other endpoints like Schema and Activity Stream and the new preferences stuff. So first we're going to go over the access token one. I'm going to show this as a slide because I'm not really keen on releasing one of my refresh tokens accidentally. So basically you're going to make a post request to this endpoint auth access token, and then in that you're going to pass the header, this header. This header is actually defined by the OAuth 2 spec, and it's fairly well known. You can easily find how to encode the data, but the encoded data looks like this. Basically, you're going to pass your grant type, and in this case, I'm using password, but this would be any of those grant types we looked at earlier. And then you have the data specific to that grant type. So for password, you have username and password. You pass your login, and your password is the values. If it was a refresh token, your grant type would be a refresh token, and you'd have a refresh token equals the value for your refresh token. And then all of these respond, if they're successful, assuming you haven't sent for refresh, you haven't sent an invalid token, or for any of these, you haven't sent invalid credentials, you get an object that looks like this. So like I said before, you don't actually have to hardcode bearer anywhere. It actually comes as the token type, so you can prefix all of your headers with this for your authorization. So you get bearer, and then you get your access token. This is the actual value for your access token. It's a nice long string that you'll have to pass around. You get an expires in. This is the number of seconds that the token is valid for. So 600 seconds, 10 minutes. You can then use that to calculate whether or not you should go out and use your refresh token to get a new access token, or that if your access token is still valid. And then the last thing is your refresh token. It looks just like the access token, it's just a lot longer. But we don't give the expiration for this. We just say, okay, well, we know it is 24 hours. So that is up to you to keep track of. So I'll go back to the list, and then we'll jump over to Postman. So I'm gonna go through Postman. You can follow, if you wanna play around with Postman, you can get it from the link in our documentation. This collection is not the collection that's actually there. It has the same name because I copied it, edited it. But basically it's just, Postman will give us some good information about how to, or Postman gives us a good way to demo this. And one thing I will show really quickly is, like, if we go down, we'll look at the info again. So if we hit send, we'll get back the data we saw and the other requests. But one cool thing about Postman, you can click code over here, and you can select even more languages and even more tools for generating code that works with it. So there is a C# example in here. There's some Go code. This actually Go code is slightly better, I think, in my opinion, than the Go code in the docs, but just because the one in the docs is trying to be more generic, and then everything else, different tools in the shell, everything you can need. And the one benefit of the docs one versus this one is the docs one actually knows what parameters are available for the endpoints, whereas this one, our collections don't have all the parameters. They just have the example of some of the parameters. So let's jump in, and let's take this one. We'll delete this query string and we'll re-add it. So we're going to look at the shot endpoint for under entity. Their shots. This is going to return the first 500 shots on my site. We've got all the things here. We can see, if we go down to the very bottom, you can see we've got a record. It doesn't have any attributes or relationships because we didn't request any columns. It's got our ID, it's got our links, and this is what I was talking about before. It's a link directly to the record for this specific record. And then we've got our pagination. So automatically, since it knows we're on page 1, it doesn't put a previous because there's no page 0. And it'll give us the next page. So we can click this and run this, and it'll go to the next page. But we'll do that ourselves, and we're gonna add some stuff here. So I'm gonna open up the parameters here, and let's start filtering it down. Let's say first thing we want to do is filter out. We only want the project Big Black Bunny. I just happen to know that's project 65 on my site, if I could type. So we run that, and now we'll only get back projects for things that are part of project Big Black Bunny. Let's go ahead and there's not enough information really there to know what we're doing. So let's go and add code and project and status list. And let's get the sequence. That could be useful. So we run that. And now we've got, here, let me scroll the whole window down. Now we've got a lot more information. We've got some attributes that are like our code and our status, because those are just normal columns. And then we've got our relationships. So we've got our project relationship, which will give us a input. We've got a self, which is our reference to our current object in this column that we're looking at. And we've got our endpoint for specifically that full record. Same with sequence, same thing. If you had a multi-entity here, you would have a list of records, and the related would be gone, because we don't list every single thing that's in that list, because it could be pretty long. So yeah, we can go a little bit further with this. We'll go back up to parameters, and we'll add some more filters. Let's add a filter and say we just want to do the status list. Then this time we want to do, let's find all the final shots and all the on hold shots. And now, so we only have Big Black Bunny shots that are final or hold, and we can see some data about them. And that's pretty useful, but you can see our query string starting to get kind of long and kind of complicated. So let's take the same thing and let's just move it over into a search. So we'll jump over here. I'm going to delete the pagination because I was playing around with it, but I'll show you the pagination on this one. And then I've got a body already in here. So you'll see we're passing basically the same thing. It looks more like the Python API, like how you would do it in Python API. We've got an array of filters. Each filter is an array, and it's the standard objects that you've seen all the time when using Python. And then we've got our fields key, it's just an array of field names. You can actually put this in the query string also if you wanted, or in the query string instead of this. It'll actually pick the one in the body over the query string if you have both. And so that's the data. And then the big thing to note is we've passed a content type header to say that is the API 3 style or array style. And we get back the same data when we do. So we can play around with pagination now. So for these, I like to put the pagination, or for searches, I like to put the pagination in the URL. I've already got one here, so we're just gonna go ahead and run it. But basically I did page number equals 1 and page size equals 5. And if we run that, we see this and we get back 5 records on page 1. And then we get back our self and our next, and so we can go to page 2. And we got the next 5 records. And here we see we now have a previous to go back to page 1. If we go to like page 200 though, you'll see we don't get any data back, but we get next and previous still, because we don't know how many records there are, because we try not to calculate that, because sometimes it can be a performance issue. So one of the things we saw back on, let's go back here for a second, is we've got our related link here. So I'm going to show you what this actually is. We're going to go and look at projects or users on a project, because that seems usually a more useful one in this case. So here we've got our endpoint. We're looking at project 65, our relationships, and then the users column, the users field on that record. And so if we run this, basically what we're going to get is we're just going to get a data structure, and then it's an array of all the users that are set on that project. And I think this can be useful for a few things, like if you want to lazy load just the users for a web page or something, like you don't want to have to deal with the extra structure that exists if you do it through, and you don't want, let's say you don't want to deal with the extra structure that exists when you do it through the normal query. So this query is exactly the same as saying fields users. It's nested further down. And when you just say, just give me the field versus when you say, give me the relationship. So yeah, this one you'd have to go data, relationships, users, data, and get back the list. Whereas the other one's just data and the list. Yeah, this is also one of those things that's part of the JSON API, in that you can use it if you want or not. I mean, it's up to you. There are multiple ways to get the same data. So let's start getting into some more complex things. Let's start looking at how to deal with files, because we all have to deal with files a lot. So actually, I need to go change one thing really quickly, because I forgot to before this presentation. Log into my site. So we're going to look at a project. We've got Big Book Bunny here somewhere when it loads up. Yep. We're going to change. Let's just change the thumbnail really quickly, so we have something that looks like normal site. Okay, so we've got our normal thumbnail for Big Book Bunny. We're going to jump back over to Postman, and so on the off of the record endpoint, you have the ability to put a field here, and this is only for images and files. And so what this allows you to do is if you just do it like this, you'll get the metadata for that record. So in this case, since it's a thumbnail, we're only going to get the URL to that image. Right now, it's actually on my server because it hasn't moved to S3 yet. And then if we want to get other data about that, we can use alternate formats. So it's a thumbnail, so let's get the thumbnail. So if we do alt equals thumbnail, we'll get back the thumbnail. If we do alt equals original, we will get back the original file. And this also works for attachments. So if we jump over to an attachment like the billboard, if we do the metadata, we get back the same hash that you would normally see if you requested an attachment. So we got the URL, the name, the content type, the links, and the attachment record ID and type. And then we've got a link to the same thing we're on. And then we can also say original and get back the original billboard file. So this is that file. So let's jump in and let's try to change that thumbnail, because doing the uploads is a little bit different in the REST API, because we hid some stuff. Like I said before, we hid some stuff from the user when you're using the Python API. When we moved to S3, it became a multi-request process, and we kind of hid that just behind upload. So now you're actually getting exposed to that when you see it in the REST API. So it's 3 steps. The first step is you need to request an upload URL. And this basically tells the server, you're telling the server, hey, I want to upload this file to this, in this case, this column, which is the image column on Project 65. And I want to, it's going to give you back some information about the upload, like when you started and things like that, and what type it is, and the upload URL to where to put the file, and the completion URL where you're going to send this metadata that you received from this request and another one. So let's start that out. So I'm going to upload a file called bunny thumbnail. And we're going to get back this data. And this data is just some metadata to say, okay, well, started at this time. The upload is a thumbnail, because we know the column is a thumbnail column on the server side. An upload ID, for S3, for shotgun uploads, you're going to get an upload ID you'll have to put here. For S3 uploads, you won't get an upload ID, but if you're dealing with multi-part, you'll have something more complicated where you have to gather all the E tags over the multi-part upload and put them here and in an E tag key. We tell you where it's going. So SG, so it's going to the shotgun server because it's an image. If you were uploading a version movie, it would be going to S3. So it would be more you would get a different URL, and it would say it was S3 here. And then it's not multi-part because we don't support multi-part for the shotgun server, but we only support it for S3. And then the name that I passed in. And this is just because sometimes people will pass in things like Unicode, special Unicode characters, or things that are supposed to be malicious, and that we have to filter out. So we keep the name for display purposes, but we have to filter it out when we do the upload itself. So we got an upload URL here. Basically, it just has the same name that we passed in, and then a signature to say it's validated. I'm going to copy the signature over to here really quickly and paste it in. And so this is the next step. So let's actually go back to this for a second. So this data you need to store. It will be used in the last step of the process. And this is the same for thumbnails and attachments. It's all the same process. And so next step is to put the file on the server. So we're going to go to the URL that we were just given. I had it pre-populated, just different signature. And then we're going to set some headers. We need to set the content type. So I know the image I'm uploading is a PNG, so image PNG. And I already looked up the size of the file. So content length is equal to the value of the size of the file. These are needed for both the shotgun uploads and the S3 uploads. So you'll have to remember to put those in to make sure your upload goes through. And then the last thing we're going to do, we'll go over to the body, and we actually need to pick the file to upload. So I'm going to upload this bunny thumbnail that I have. And if we do send, we'll get back. If everything goes well, we'll, see, I had a typo. If everything goes, so actually maybe that's a good example of the error, by the way. So we'll go back. So error here, this one doesn't have the source, but it just tells you the signature didn't match. It tells you what our internal error code was, and then what the HTTP error code was. And in this case, the error ID was 1. But if we go back to this, upload it again. Okay, so now we have our information about this. We got a 200 saying it was okay. We've got our upload ID that we need for completing the URL, or completing the upload. This will basically just say, hey, this is the file I uploaded, connect it. Now I need to connect that to the entity I want to connect it to, and in this case, specifically the column I want to connect it to. It returns the original file name still. And then you have the URL you want to hit, or you want to post to complete. So we're going to jump over to the completion part. So I've already copied that URL over. We're going to go back here. We're going to grab the data object for here, and we're going to put that into the body. So I'm just going to paste over the one I already have. So basically, you have the first section is your upload info. And this is all the information you've gathered while going through this process. So the basic data that we gathered from the requesting the upload URL, and then you'll notice that upload ID is none, so we need to come back over here, grab our upload ID. Now we've got our upload ID from our upload, so we can associate that file with this record project 65 and the image column. And then, yeah, so we do a post here, and we can get the upload it. So this upload data is specific to attachments. This is where you can set fields on the attachment itself. So you could set the display name and the tags here. So if you're working with attachments, it's kind of nice that you don't have to go back and edit the attachment after it's been created. But yeah, so we run this. If everything goes well, you'll get a 201 created. You'll get no body, but your attachment should be there now. So if we can just go to project thumbnail, and we can say, show me the original now. And we should have our picture of the bunny. There we go. So yeah, so that's how you deal with files. The process for I wanted to do a multi-part example in Python for this, but it turned out it was going to take me like 10 minutes to explain all the code, because it's about 50 to 60 lines of code to deal with it. But I'll just kind of explain how the multi-part works. So for uploads, you would just say, you would add multi-part equals true here, or multi-part upload equals true. You would get for the links, you'd get back something slightly different. You'd get an upload URL that points to S3. You'd also get a next part URL. That next part URL is what you'll have to call after every upload to get the next upload URL. So you chunk your file into smaller chunks so that it can move up. You can upload them to S3. You'll loop over each chunk. You'll upload it. You'll then request the next part URL. You'll upload the next part. You'll keep doing this, and you'll be gathering the e-tags that are in the responses on each one. And then at the very end, when you're doing the complete, you'll have this will be multi-part true, and you'll have a new key e-tags, and that will be an array of all the e-tags that you've received from Amazon. And what we'll do when you do the complete is we'll go tell Amazon, hey, we've been told all these e-tags are one file, and Amazon will associate them all together. So yeah, but yeah, in code, that's a little bit more fun because you have to deal with figuring out the sizes and how many chunks you need to upload and stuff like that. So yeah, the last couple of things, since we do have some time still, because I somehow went way faster than every other time I've gone through this presentation, is so let's look at some of the schema stuff. So let's start out with saying, okay, we're looking at schema of version. If we do this, we'll just see the basic entity information about the version entity. You can pass project ID equals a project ID to see if it's been hidden for that project. It'll change the visible status. We can go a bit further. We can say, well, I want to see all the fields on version, and this will give you back all the fields as keys of the data object. And same thing, you can pass back the you can pass in the project ID to see if they're visible, if those fields are visible on your project. And then we can actually even go one step further and just say, hey, I want to see this specific column. So I'm going to look up SG uploaded movie, since that's one of the more important columns on the version. And so, yeah, then you get just specifically the information about that column. And so, yeah, if you do, when you're doing the other CRUD operations for Schema, you can do a post to fields and add a field, or you can do a put to this record and update certain values here if you want to update things. And then you can do a delete to, like, if you want to delete this field, we can just switch this to delete and delete the field if it was allowed. So one of the other endpoints that we've also added lately, or that's been in the Python API for a while, but we've just added to 7.10 for the REST API, is the activity stream. I just wanted to show that you can, given a project in this case, and the record ID, you can say, give me the activity stream, and you'll get back all the updates for that project that were put into the activity stream for you. There's a bunch of extra parameters that you can look up. They're all on they're all in the documentation under the entity activity stream section. And then, so the last thing I'm going to cover, I think, is the preferences. So preferences is the new endpoint that we have to getting back certain preference information. So you can run this, do a GET request, and you'll just get back a bunch of mainly formatting information and things like is local storage on. And these are just the preference values for your site. If you decide that you don't want all of those, you can always just say prefs equals, and then I'm saying I want the format date fields and the support local storage, and I'll only get back those values. Yeah, so that was most of the stuff. Since I do have a few extra minutes, I'll just jump down to some of the ones that I was calling old that I pulled out of this, just to show you some of things like creates. So like I said before, the creates are actually really just like any other REST API. You're going to do a post. You're going to send it to whatever you want to create. So in my case, I'm creating a entity projects, and I'm just sending whatever columns that I want to set values for. So if we do that, actually I need to change the name because I already have a webinar 2. I'm up to webinar 4. And what will get returned is the full record that you just created. So you'll get back all the columns that were set by default when the creation happened, anything like that. And so updates are exactly the same, actually, except the only difference is, so if we wanted to do an update, where is put? So update, I'm going to go grab the ID right down here really quickly. And so for an update, if we just wanted to change the status or change the name of this, let's say, to my cool project or something. So let's delete that stuff out. Let's add to the URL that we want to update project 118. And say my cool project. And we can run that. And we look, the name has been updated to my cool project. And we got back the full record again. So that we got any changes that happen from that value changing any other values through like some of the triggers we have, that you'll automatically get all that information. Yeah, so I think that's all of my examples. So we'll jump back to the slide deck and, okay, good. And I got the beach ball of death. Hold on. Maybe.
We're seeing everything's working with your slide deck.
Oh, really? For me, it was just a beach ball. Okay, so Q&A. So yeah, so any questions you have, we can go through them. If we don't have time to go through all of them, you can always contact support. And support will either answer them or redirect them to us if they need more guidance.
We don't have any questions yet in the little Q&A box, but if you guys do have any questions, please submit them. We've got time. Oh, but there's one in the chat from Tony. Is there an ability to have a store of the requests by a user using a token to undo their PUTs? Say a script goes awry for whatever reason. Sorry, PUTs, they're puts. Or we have some asynchronous task that determines whatever we just did was invalid. Wouldn't we want an ability to undo whatever that user did?
No, it's the same as the way it is in the current system. Like the REST API is just a layer on top of the same levels, the same code that runs the Python API. It's just a new interface to it. We did try to clean up some of the stuff, but yeah, we haven't added anything new like that because some of our features actually, the REST API and the Python API actually go through the exact same code path. So until we decide to update both, we won't be doing features like that, I guess.
Any other questions, guys? We got time. We're here.
Yeah, I finished this 4 minutes early.
Here's another question. How are you seeing performance between the APIs? Is there any difference between REST and our Python API?
We haven't seen any decrease in performance. It's about the same. It really depends on, like in the Python API, it kind of depends on what you're querying in general. There are cases where I found one that I could make slow yesterday, where I could, if I requested 5,000 records with all the columns, and it had about 100 columns on it. It was slow, but that's kind of expected. But yeah, we haven't seen any major. There's been no complaints about performance yet. In our tests, actually, we've seen some cases where the REST API actually was faster, and I think some of that has to do with if you're using things like requests and you're using a session, that you're not reopening the connection all the time to make some of those requests, which is kind of nice. In the Python API, I think we are doing that in some cases, and in some cases for things like uploads and downloads, you're having to recreate new sessions. But yeah.
Anything else? Any other questions?
Comments, concerns?
Comments, concerns? Positive, negative?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess we got one positive. You guys are awesome. I love this.
Thanks.
And it looks great. Great. Good. We're glad.
Thanks.
Hopefully you guys will get some good use out of it. I wanted to mention one other very quick SIGGRAPH related thing before we close up here. Autodesk has a code where you can get a free floor pass. So I will share that in the chat. If you use that code when you're signing up, you can get a floor pass for free. So hopefully there were some people that were on the fence that will make it so that we do get to see you guys there. And Manny posted the link again to all of our goings on at SIGGRAPH. So if you guys are going to be in Vancouver, we do hope to see you. And if you do have questions about the REST API, please feel free to put in a ticket at supportcheckandsoftware.com, as Brandon mentioned. Oftentimes they go directly to him, so you'll hear it from the horse's mouth. And I think that's it. Hold on. I'm getting a message. Oh, yes. And Manny just reminded me to mention that. And if you aren't there physically in Vancouver for the Dev Day sessions, we will be recording those and we'll release those out to you guys so that you can reap the benefits after the fact virtually. So that way we'll make sure that everyone gets that information. And we're also recording this, so if you have people who wanted to be here who aren't, we'll release that out to you guys. All right, awesome. I think that's it. Thanks so much, Brandon. I think that was awesome.
Yeah, thanks.
See you guys at the next one, or in Vancouver, or on the dev list. Cool. Bye, all.
Bye.